My name's Trish Roberts and you're watching Faint Signals from Vega, and we're just attempting to do a little chat about the Ruddock Review for Religious Freedom in Australia, and this is Dee Dee River, and we're hoping that it won't start raining in the middle of it because we live in Tasmania and it's a large island.
Changes frequently.
And the weather just flips,
It's
suddenly.
been beautiful and suddenly it starts to rain.
Yeah. So anyway, if you'd like to tell us about the Ruddock Review for Religious Freedom, and this is in Australia, by the way, in relation to the LGBTI community. So if you could just tell us a bit about that, Dee Dee.
Okay, well, the Ruddock Review came into the political mind of the coalition, which is the Conservative government. It's the Liberal National Party coalition, and don't be confused by the name Liberal Party. In the Australian tradition, political parties tend to be named by something they're not. They are the Conservatives here. And last year, in an effort to avoid actually taking parliamentary action on religious freedom, the government tried to create a plebiscite to put it to the people whether there should be marriage equality. The problem with that, which was perceived by the queer community, the LGBTI plus community, is that it would create an opening for a number of months for opponents of marriage equality to advertise and be in the news and so on, and to basically put out messages of homophobia for months on end. And so at the urging of the LGBTI community, the Labour Party and the Green Party and other minor party senators voted it down. Basically, Parliament said no to a plebiscite. Unlike Ireland, in Australia there is no need for a plebiscite because in Ireland same-sex or marriage was defined within the Constitution. Only a plebiscite could change that, and that's why there was a plebiscite in Ireland. In Australia, that's not the case. Parliament is the one to change it. The plebiscite would have no binding power. It was effectively just an opinion poll. When an actual plebiscite in which people would be one person, one vote, and in Australia people are obliged to vote. When that happened, when that was knocked back, the government decided to create a survey through the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is basically just an opinion poll. It was a non-binding, voluntary survey. In other words, they would just come and say, would you like same-sex marriage, yes or no? And people could answer if they wanted to, they could not answer if they wanted to, and there was very little control. There wasn't the control that you'd have in an election or a plebiscite, where people would be ticked off, against a list of who is actually a citizen. The result was predictably that the actual result of the survey was that some 65% of Australians were in favor of same-sex marriage, and all that did was really confirm almost every properly conducted poll. Now, the ABS survey was not a properly conducted statistical poll because Do you mind if I'm
No,
wrapping
no,
on
no,
like
this is
Is
fine.
okay?
No, no, this is
It
fine.
was not a properly conducted statistical poll because basically it didn't sample the population in relation to demographics, gender, and so on. It wasn't an accurate sample because it was voluntary. Now, an opinion poll like the News poll or the Galaxy polls and that kind of thing that are done by research companies make sure that they get proportional representation from the various demographics. And nevertheless, the participation was extremely high. Something like 80% of the population participated. There were a number of mistakes and problems where surveys were found, bundled up in people's backyards. Surveys were found burned in piles. Obviously, people had run around and taken surveys out of other people's post boxes. Who knows how
Yes,
many
it
of
was
those?
extremely fair, wasn't it?
It was really fair. Who knows how many of those? And most of the indication is that it was done by people who didn't like the survey.
And didn't we have fun doing it? That
Could be told by could be told by the fact that they were burned, or mailboxes were covered in shit and things like this.
But we had lots of fun, didn't we, having to sign something that says
Do you think gay and lesbian people should have the same rights as everybody else?
Yeah, that was loads of fun to sign.
To marry who they love, as opposed to having to marry somebody of the opposite sex if they wanted to marry.
Yeah. Could you imagine if you were heterosexual having to sign something like that about yourself?
Have
Charming.
a survey of the rest of the population whether they thought you could get married to the people you love.
Yeah, really. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, Didi.
It did present an opportunity for all of the opponents of LGBTI rights to carry on at length. There were articles in the newspaper virtually every day, in the evening news, on radio, and so on. And to be fair and balanced, of course, they had to go out and find the most rampant homophobic and transphobic people they could.
And we have them here in Australia, just like the United States.
We have them everywhere. Fortunately, they are a minority, as the survey proved.
Yeah.
But it gave them a chance to get on their soapboxes and say things like LGBTI parents, gay and lesbian parents, or same-sex parents, are a danger to their children. They abuse children. That children are harmed by having...
Sorry, I'm just wanting to put that there.
By having same-sex parents. Now, this is in spite of the fact that almost all research conducted in Australia and internationally show precisely the opposite. Nearly all of those research papers show that there is at least no difference between the situation, between the outcome for children, whether the parents are same-sex parents or opposite-sex parents, or indeed, any kind of combination, as long as they receive love and care and support. I say at least it showed that because many of the surveys showed that the children of same-sex parents actually fared better than on a number of indices of harm than opposite-sex parents. And I would really, as somebody who is scientifically trained and statistically trained, I would say the result of that is mainly because in the case of same-sex parents, the children are always wanted and always desired. And in the case of opposite-sex parents, accidents happen. And so you have situations where the children were not particularly wanted and not particularly cared for. And so if you measured it against wanted opposite sex parents, it would probably come out about the same. Or parents who want opposite sex parents who wanted their children. Anyway, the religious right here, we don't have much of a religious right, and that's probably because the majority of Australians are not strongly religious. The 2016 poll showed that of the various categories people were allowed to tick, this was in the national census, the majority of people ticked non-religious. And this was not, non-observant or non-compliant religious. This was non-religious.
And unfortunately, though, we've got Hillsong, which is sort of a right-wing.
That doesn't stop us from having Hillsong.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's a group run by Lyle Sheldon called the Australian Christian Lobby. And their primary purpose seems to be to generate homophobia and transphobia.
Yeah, and Christians should be
almost the only thing they do.
Yeah, Christian should be in quotes because there's nothing Christian about that lobby.
Yeah.
Sadly, they, often these people, they use that word and they use it to get tax deductible status, don't they? Do they get tax deductible?
Yeah, they would get tax deductible status.
Yeah.
As
and yet there's got nothing to do with being a Christian, really.
Well, I mean, Christianity in their case is just something to hang their hatred on. And they use it as a motive for hatred, as a justification for hatred. But primarily, if you look at, if we want to go to the Bible, Jesus said, by the fruits you should know them. If you look at the fruits of the Australian Christian Lobby, they don't try and help anyone. All they try and do is foment hatred and division.
I grew up as a Catholic. I'm not Catholic now, but we never learnt anything about hatred towards gay people. I never heard any sort of preaching of hatred toward any group, and we focused on the New Testament. And so this, whatever they're promoting, I'm not familiar with it at all, and it's sort of right. It's a very common, a very sad thing, and a common thing that. Like they do that in the United States with the Westboro Baptist Church. That's an extreme example. And then there's many, many groups that are call themselves Christian or whatever, and they're just horrific. And Hillsong, I think they're anti-gay, aren't they? They're homophobic.
I don't think they're particularly homophobic. They think that homosexuality is, I think, wrong.
Well, that's homophobic. If they think it's wrong, then that's pretty homophobic.
Yeah.
And it's that whole love the sinner, hate the sin rubbish.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they're also getting money from the likes of Justin Bieber, who's loaded and very kind of naive, and I don't know. So it's sort of it's very unfortunate, and that oftentimes right-wing groups, like I don't know if the United States is sort of possibly even feeding into that, because they like to promote fundamentalism, don't they, in other countries? So who knows? But anyway, I don't want to interrupt. What?
All I was saying is that at the time, Tony Abbott, who is one of our conservative politicians,
he's special.
And he's really special. Erica Betts is another special one, but Tony Abbott is really special. He was prime minister for a bit of time until they threw him out. he's now a backbencher in his party, but he seems to exercise an inordinate amount of power,
Yeah.
and still gets quoted in the press all the time for his bigotry and what have you.
The corporate press, the corporate,
The corporate
mainstream media, just
Murdoch media,
Murdoch
and
media,
Fairfax media,
and they love to.
and that's everything basically.
They love to promote, anything that's right wing or anything that's bigoted.
Yeah.
That's their bag, you know.
There are better and worse newspapers, but basically they're all owned by in a very few hands, and most of them are pretty bad.
He's Swifty. Swifty's a bit hungry, aren't you, Swift?
Oh, Swifty.
Poor Swift. He's on a bit of a diet right now.
So we had Tony Abbott talking about how if you allowed marriage equality, it would end freedom of speech and religious freedom. And the religious freedom he seemed to be talking about was the freedom to discriminate against LGBTI people.
So you wrote
now-
a letter, didn't you, Dee Dee, about this religious freedom thing, which is just an excuse for the Conservative government to bring in some ways that the, in quotes, Christian...
Oh, yeah, okay. So
yeah,
we'll
sorry.
go to
I'm sorry, yes,
the
please continue.
Ruddock review.
thing, yeah.
I mean, one of the things I just wanted to say
Sure,
first off,
no worries.
one of the features of the whole campaign against marriage equality is that almost nobody on the no side talked about marriage equality. They were talking about the right of LGBTI people to have children and raise children and how abusive they were. And they were talking about the danger of gender fluidity. Now, what gender fluidity has to do with marriage equality, or marriage equality has to do with gender fluidity? I have no idea.
Yeah, it was just a big excuse, wasn't it, to have a
It
go?
was, well, I think basically they figured there's not enough people in Australia who really, who don't like or hate gay and lesbian people. And they figured, well, homophobia is probably not the best way in. We'll go for transphobia because there's still a number of transphobes around.
Yeah.
We can generate hatred more easily that way. And so that was one of the key things. There was 3 months of that crap. In the end, they tried to put a number of amendments when the survey was finished and Parliament finally took the thing on. They had to, they put it to the law because it had to go through the legal processes. And they tried to put amendments to the bill to say that people had the religious freedom and freedom of conscience to discriminate and refuse to sell things to LGBTI people, they wanted exemptions from the anti-discrimination laws that we have for anybody who claimed that they were discriminating on the basis of religion or conscience, in the recognition that there's an awful lot of people who really cannot claim to be religious, but are still homophobic.
Yeah.
And they wanted to protect those people's rights to discriminate also.
Yeah.
All of the amendments were defeated, and at that point the government said, okay, we'll allow this to be defeated, but we're going to have a review of the anti-discrimination laws in relation to religious freedom. And that government review would be led by Philip Ruddock, who is a noted conservative who has in the past been basically homophobic and anti-LGBTI. He's been he's been opposed to marriage equality. He's been opposed to various rights of LGBTI people. So they chose him to lead this review into religious freedom and the rights that the religious should have, basically to discriminate against LGBTI and other people. So that's what that review is about. Now,
He was an awful Attorney General
he
too,
was an
wasn't
awful
he?
Attorney General.
He was sort of very anti refugees in a way, wasn't he? He was sort of racist and yuck. It all goes together often, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Like
he's somebody who's basically opposed to rights on a number of minorities.
Yes, just the sort of person you want in power.
So this struggle over religious freedom and the rights of people to be discriminatory in the name of religion is something that has been used in the United States and is being used currently to wind back all kinds of laws made to protect the equality of all people. And that includes LGBTI people. One of the worst is that if people feel in their religious sense of conscience that LGBTI people are bad or sinful or wrong in some way, and they work in a medical capacity as paramedics, ambulance drivers, in an emergency ward, in a hospital, they can refuse to treat LGBTI people.
Charming.
Now, that's hideous. I mean, that goes right back to the situation with Tyra Banks, who was a young trans woman. She was 25 years old.
In the U.S.
In Washington, D.C. And she was in an auto accident. She had transitioned many years before. And when they started cutting away her clothes to treat her in a first aid sense, they found that she had a penis. And so the paramedics stopped, stood on the footpath and laughed and made jokes as she lay dying. This provoked a lot of horror and some reaction from the population around, but ultimately it meant that she did not get the treatment she needed. She got taken to the hospital late. She didn't get the treatment she needed in the emergency room, and she died.
Yeah, they weren't much better at the hospital, were they?
They weren't much better in the emergency ward.
No. And just to add, how many black trans women were killed last year? It was about 100, wasn't it? Murdered.
In the United States.
It's really outrageous in the United States.
130 or something like that.
Yeah, terrible.
No, it was less than that. It was
crimes against trans.
Yeah. Anyway, I've forgotten how many. It was only like in the United States, it was only, 25 or 26.
Was there? I thought there was.
Something like that. It was 130 worldwide, I think.
Oh, okay.
And if I remember right, my memory is not as good as it used to be. But the Trans Day of Remembrance, in a sense, you can say the Tyra Banks thing was important in that. It was a bit of a precursor. It started, the actual Trans Day of Remembrance started after the death of yet another trans woman, and Tyra Banks was a trans woman of color. A lot of the people who've been killed in the United States are trans women of color.
That what happened to Tyra Banks, that's her name, isn't it? Tyra Banks?
No, not Tyra
Sorry,
Banks.
that's that talk show host.
Tyra.
Tyra Banks.
Oh, we're confusing things
Whoops.
badly. No, Tyra Hunter.
Hunter, sorry about that, Tyra Hunter.
Yeah.
Yes, I was thinking, God, that name sounds familiar. That's because that's that ex-supermodel who has a talk show. Had a talk show.
Senior moments. I'm sorry
So
to Tyra
Hunter.
Tyra Banks and to Tyra Hunter.
Yeah, Tyra Hunter. So what happened to Tyra Hunter could happen to
anybody.
If they give religious people grounds to reject treatment of LGBTI Q people, then that can happen, and legally. And this is the sort of awful fundamentalist sort of right-wing,
It's actually
nonsense
just
that's coming.
homophobic and transphobic. There's an international homophobic and transphobic movement. Tony Abbott actually went to the United States and went to their conference. I've forgotten what the name of the organization
Looking for funding,
is.
I'm sure.
Probably, and also support in their arguments. It's like a lot of the arguments that were put against gay and lesbian marriage and against trans people in Australia during the marriage equality debate came from the United States. And there was a very notorious poster that was put out by the neo-Nazis, that was created by some neo-Nazis in Florida, and has been popularized by these anti-LGBTI hate groups. But they're working internationally at this point to wind back and to fight back against any kind of LGBTI rights.
Yes, it's part of the rise of the right, really, which is happening in the United States, isn't it? I mean, this is what happens. Neoliberalism has sort of helped promote this in a way by, when austerity measures and when it starts getting very difficult for people, the population ends up turning on minority groups, don't they? And also the media like to blame, and the government like to blame, sort of the, homeless and immigrants, and they turn against all these vulnerable groups.
Race has always been a tool of the powerful to both create divisions within the people who they're exploiting, to create a sense of, okay, the white people, and white is however they happen to define it, the white people are the good people, and they're on side with the rulers.
Yeah.
And so they can be proud of themselves against these other people. And the other people are the dark people, although the England used to do that to the Irish. But I mean, they've done it to the Southern Europeans, who they, for a while, called black. Then the Africans and Muslims,
it's a white
Hispanic
supremacist sort of attitude and white supremacist governments.
It's just a use of race in order to divide people.
Yeah.
And it helps to actually fuel the neocolonialism. If they have a group of people who think that they're better, and these brown people are worse, then it helps to enlist those people as cannon fodder to use in their imperialist wars.
And speaking of imperialism and white supremacy, I'll be chatting with Ajama Baraka, who he's been a long-term veteran of the Black Liberation Movement, and he was the vice president candidate on the ticket for the Green Party, and he writes for the Black Agenda Report, and he has an organization, Black Alliance for Peace, and he speaks so eloquently about imperialism, anti-imperialism and anti-war and white supremacy, and so I'll be interviewing him on the 2nd of February at 9:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. So if you're in the United States, that's 9:15 Eastern Daylight Savings Time, and if you're in Australia, that's 1:15 p.m. On Saturday, the 3rd of February.
He's been working for most of his life, and he's basically my age.
Oh, hang on a sec. I want to just say where you can find that.
Okay.
If you go to Real Progressives on Facebook, that's at Real Progressive, singular, at Real Progressive on Facebook. You can find that at 9:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time on the 2nd of February. That's a Friday. Okay, so let's continue on. So we were talking about white supremacy and
Just to say, he's been working on human rights most of his life,
Yeah.
including sexual rights.
He's such an important person. I don't think people realize how important he is today, because there's so little in the way of an anti-imperialist, anti-war movement, and it's desperately needed. In Australia, it's desperately needed, and in the United States, absolutely, because they're at the center of the U.S. empire is at the center of a lot of these wars and imperialist wars for resources and hegemony. So it's really, really important that we support people like Jama Baraka and his cause, and be against war and against imperialism, because millions of brown people are being killed for these wars for hegemony and resources. There was something else I wanted to say. And he's as important, or probably he's as important as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. That's how important his voice is in the movement. So it's very important we support him and Black Alliance for Peace, and because it's a global sort of a movement to end imperialism and war, and it's desperately needed. Okay, so we'll just continue on with.
Okay.
So we were talking about white supremacy and.
Yes, we were talking about white supremacy and racism and stuff like that.
A couple of whiteys talking about white supremacy.
Basically, you've got race has been one of the big targets, but any kind of minority, this otherization, this we-them thing, that is basically a tool of power, because there's a couple of different things. As soon as you create, and this is a bit off the topic of religious freedom, but when you create a situation where there's an us and a them, then somebody has to define where the boundary is between us and them. And in the case of race or religion or whatever, it's apparently clear until you get to situations like people in the United States were characterized as black if they had one drop of black blood. Now,
whatever that means.
On what basis is that? That's just insane on the face of it. And yet that's how it's characterized. And that way you can discriminate against people. And like the whole American thing, the House Un-American Activities Committee and all that kind of pro-American thing that they've invented. Actually, it was invented by, what's his name? Anyway, in around 1920, in the Palmer raise, Mitchell Palmer, who was Attorney General at the time, was going after socialists, and he invented the idea of anti-Americanism. And if you were engaged in anti-American activities, then you were evil and suspect.
And that's happening today. And that's happening today.
Yeah, I mean, that was the precursor to the McCarthy thing. It happened at the time when there was actually a strong socialist movement in the United States.
Yeah.
Gene Debs was a presidential candidate, even though he was in prison.
Yeah. And we need socialism today. We need a social, don't we, Dee Dee?
We've always needed socialism.
Yeah, but we desperately need it today, and we need to get rid of neoliberalism and, and crush it.
The disparities in power are insane and allow people to basically abuse vast populations of people. And those in power, of course, have the ability to create laws to their benefit and enforce those laws.
I just want to say, in the United States, Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, don't buy things off Amazon. It's a horrific site that he treats the employees like crap. A lot of them are on food stamps, the Amazon employees, and drivers have to take a urinal bottle with them. That's how pressed they are for time. I mean,
because they can't get to the toilet.
They can't get to the bathroom. So, Jeff Bezos also owns the Washington Post, which is very closely associated with the CIA. And Jeff Bezos, in one day, earned $2.6 billion. This is the sort of, the three people apparently, three oligarchs, own more than 90% of the world's population. They own more wealth. And this is absolutely, it's an aberration, it's disgusting, particularly with the extent of social inequality now and the poverty, the austerity measures everywhere. This is absolutely unacceptable, and that's why, we have to push against this and organize. Hey, Dee Dee.
Yeah.
This is absolutely unacceptable. And in America, a report came out that it's not a democracy, it's an oligarchy. Yeah. And, you'll just see that all these governments, like the Australian government, they really don't have that much interest in the population and population doing well, do they?
No, not at all.
They pretend to, as usual, but they don't. They don't have any interest in social equality.
Pure concentration of wealth here, just like everywhere.
Yeah.
Basically, things are being set up to ensure the concentration of wealth. The difference between the Conservative Party and the so-called liberal parties here it's the Labour Party.
Yeah. There's hardly any difference.
Mainstream, liberal left parties, is that the left parties basically believe that the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few should go slowly enough to avoid basically civil unrest and revolution.
So they do it very, very slowly, but it's happening. And they're taking away Medicare, aren't they, slowly?
And the Conservatives basically don't give a shit.
No.
They think they can just force it on people.
And they do the good cop, bad cop thing, but really the Labor Party here, which is one of the two major parties, is quite happy for the Conservative Party, the LNP, to take away rights and to take away health care bit by bit and all of that, because then they don't have to do it. And so they let they're happy with the LNP that it does that, even though they're protesting in public that they think it's awful and stuff. They're quite happy when it happens.
Although some of the changes, like the imposition of charges on tertiary education, because the Conservatives are certainly going to support those measures.
Yes, that's right. So it was actually Keating and Hawke.
And you've got no one else to vote for.
It was actually the Prime Ministers Keating and Hawke who actually did a lot of damage and brought in a lot of the taking away of free education and stuff, didn't they?
Yeah.
After Gough Whitlam, who was a really great Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Who was dismissed.
Who was Labour.
And by the way, the American CIA admitted that they helped get Gough Whitlam dismissed. We had a democratic socialist kind of a government, and the CIA helped get rid of that. Yeah. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
And this is what happens. The CIA meddles in other people's governments because they're not interested in democracy and they're not interested in social equality. They're interested in interfering with other governments, getting the government they want and manipulating the government, and that's what they've been doing all around the world, U.S. empire, which has 800 to 1,000 bases all over the world.
Yeah.
That has to end.
Yeah.
I mean, anyway, so we got off the track of the religious freedom. Did you want to say anything else more about religious freedom and that thing that Ruddock is trying to do?
Yeah, basically what...
Our cats are all excited because it's windy.
The whole idea of religious freedom as a right to discriminate is ahistorical. The idea of religious freedom is a liberal humanist idea, and it came as a reaction to state religion, where during the Middle Ages, the church basically was an empire. The princes of the church was pretty much a literal term. They owned vast swaths of territory. They had serfs who worked on their farms.
You're talking about the Pope now?
We're talking about basically Catholicism here.
Catholicism, yeah.
And they had palaces, for the cardinals and the bishops and that kind of thing.
Jesus would. would have been so proud.
Yeah, Jesus would have been proud. And, you know, they would, you know, you had things like the Spanish Inquisition. They would kill people.
In the most horrific ways.
In the most horrific ways, who deviated from their idea of how things should be. And they told kings, they sanctified kings and told kings, in a sense, how to behave.
And wasn't that, the Inquisition, wasn't that incredibly misogynist as well, and it was a way of taking away property from women?
Yeah, part of that was involved in the establishment of patriarchy, you know, or the reinforcement of patriarchy. Patriarchy was already there.
Yeah.
But the reinforcement of patriarchy and taking away the rights of women, the Bible, they use that as justification.
Notice how they always, with the Bible, particularly these, you know, sort of conservative Christian groups, they always pick and choose, cherry pick with the Bible.
Yeah.
They don't, I mean, there's some outrageous things in the Bible of sort of stoning people if they wear polycotton or something, and or not polycotton, mixed fabrics and stuff like that. Yeah. They never sort of say, oh, well, let's start killing people who wear mixed fabrics.
Women if they can't prove that they are virgins by bleeding when they have sex with their husband for the first time. Yeah. If there's not demonstrable blood, the Bible advises them to be taken back to their parents and killed.
See, that's charming. Anyway, there's heaps of that, and
but I mean,
the book
there's
is full of
misogyny,
slavery, rape. There's all sorts of things.
There's all sorts of things that
going
are
on in the
Bible.
Anyway, so they don't, never ever really, they pick and choose what they want out of the Bible. Yeah. Anyway, so
on the other hand, they almost never pick up on things like acts where, or those things which say a person should give up all of their possessions.
Yes. Yes.
and work to help the poor.
And this is
now,
always
those things. No, those aren't. Yeah.
And this is always amusing when you see the Pope. I mean, he's a better Pope than the other popes, although he's majorly transphobic, and you should talk about that in a moment. Yeah. But he's here. He is sitting in this beautiful throne in the huge, cathedrals, talking about how we need to, be. We need to look after the poor, and we need to look after refugees or whatever.
At least he's saying those things.
At least he's saying it, but here he is sitting in this, with billions of dollars. The Vatican has huge wealth, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that saying, it's easier for a rich man to pass through the eye of a needle than to enter the gates of heaven or something. He's obviously forgotten about that one. Yeah. But anyway, let's talk about the Pope and how trans people are worse than nuclear war. That's
well, that's what he said anyway.
That's what he said.
I saw a delightful
We make a joke about that
the other day about that, saying, my goodness, if we're such supervillains, this woman was saying, how can I access my power?
Yeah.
And it was really quite entertaining.
Yeah, but seriously.
But I wanted to go back to that basic thing of religion.
Somebody needs to talk to him, though, don't they?
Yeah.
Somebody desperately needs to talk to that man about he's so ignorant about that. He thinks that it's that same sort of ridiculous notion that these faux feminists have that think that trans women are trying to take over the women's movement. For God's sake, there's there'd be less than 1 million trans women in the world, and they must be a bloody powerful group if that faux feminists think that they can take over the women's movement.
Yeah.
Seriously, trans women are having enough problem dealing with the transphobia in the world.
Are having enough problems going to the bathroom. I mean,
yes, that's right.
Really.
I mean, there's just sort of so many things they have to deal with due to. The hatred,
transphobia.
Yes, which is based on just ridiculously. It's just,
interestingly, and this might be for another discussion on gender, but I mean, interestingly, a lot of the interest in gender and the subversion of gender actually came from the feminist movement, because the conventional gender roles don't help women at all. And undermining those as normative behaviors, which would be where transgression would be punished, is important within feminism. And so it's really ironic
Yeah.
that they are insisting that trans women are a problem.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yes, and there's people on the there's some people on the left that buy into that nonsense. I don't
Yeah.
even know, like, do they even know a woman? You know, this is the thing. A lot of these people have
Well,
never even met a trans woman.
yeah,
You know, it's just based on complete ignorance.
Yeah.
If they met, and talked to groups or talked to a trans woman, and they'd realize that all these fears are just based on, it's just ridiculous. And it's so
Yeah.
sad because it's actually feeding into the already, because there's this great threat, isn't there, to stereotypes,
Yeah.
to male stereotypes and female stereotypes. There's a lot of men that freak out at this, that they're clutching on to this stereotype which is constructed
well,
and is causing
yeah.
so much damage to them and other people.
Okay.
Sorry,
yeah.
you want?
Well, we're going to talk about gender.
Yeah, we can talk about that
I
a little bit, and then maybe in another one we can talk
I
about
think another one would be a good one.
All right.
But yes, we'll just talk very briefly. I mean, I think the gendered stereotypes, the primary thing they do is reinforce patriarchy. Almost all of them are bad for people.
Yes.
Most
Men
of
are suffering, women are suffering, everybody's suffering
everybody
because of
suffers for these stereotypes, and
and
I
look at
guess
the misogyny.
people feel,
And that actually feeds into the misogyny, doesn't it? The stereotype, the male stereotype.
well, yeah,
It
yeah.
feeds into misogyny dreadfully. And if you look on social media, it's absolutely horrific, the misogyny, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's horrific.
yeah, yeah.
In Latin America, in fact, I think they have, what is it? An extraordinary amount of femicide happening in Latin
Yeah.
America.
Yeah, a lot of
Just,
the death of trans people happens in Latin America too.
oh
in
yes,
Africa.
yes, that's right. Yeah.
In spite of the fact that, in various surveys and stuff, Latin America tends to be fairly LGBTI friendly.
And every day.
But at the same time, there's quite a lot of anti-LGBTI violence that occurs.
And domestic violence is rampant in Western culture, and that's due to just the sexism that arises from male stereotypes and stuff, and also the female. We're back again. We were outside, and then suddenly the phone said it was full. I don't know why, because it wasn't full, but anyway, and it stopped working. So we thought we'd come inside and finish off what we were saying. We were talking about gender stereotypes, and I think we might leave that for another time, because it's a sort of a more complex subject, isn't it, Dee Dee?
Yeah.
And Dee Dee said, "Oh, I haven't talked about the religious freedom issue that we originally were going to talk about." So I'm going to leave that for Dee Dee to continue.
Okay. Basically, as I was saying, religious freedom was a liberal humanist idea based on the fact that religion was often connected with the state. It was incredibly oppressive. It was a structure of power. People were persecuted for not believing exactly right, or for being Jewish, or for being all kinds of things, for being women. Protestantism and the Anglican Protestantism were a reaction to this very, very strong state-like form of religion, dominant form of religion. But neither of those two forms of religion were a whole lot better. I mean, one of the first things the Anglicans did was start murdering heretics and burning them at the stake. And then they proceeded to start burning women, witches, at the stake. And in Germany, the heart of the Reformation, You also find this very strict, very dour form of Christianity, where people who were sinners were persecuted, and the witch trials went crazy, and they killed people left and right in absolutely horrific ways.
And that was something, was that something to do with property rights too, we mentioned just before, property?
No, not particularly. It had to do more with structures of power. Basically, women who might be community leaders. Certainly in England, the witch trials started where community leaders were somewhat resistant to the hold of the Lord over communities. Basically, they were villeins, or more or less serfs, where the landlord was the lord and he controlled who had property, whether they were allowed to leave, and things like this. It was very, very restrictive, and they found some resistance from the community. And women, being healers, and were often community leaders, and so they were targeted. And it also allowed all sorts of people to exercise their misogyny and hatred of women, old women. Once you start that sort of thing, hatred of women based on kind of insane ideas that they are consorting with devils and cursing people's cows.
Where does it end then?
Where does it end? You can start accusing anybody you like. And of course, land rights get involved because, or things like that, property gets involved, because if you can claim somebody as a witch and burn them at the stake, and their family too, then, well, their property's up for grabs.
Yeah, that's right.
So it could be property grabs, it could be just simple dislike. It often targeted women who are old or who may have had a mental illness. Anybody you can say is other, different, or you don't like, could be targeted. And the humanist idea is that people should be allowed to be free of this state-controlled religion. That people, I mean, in England, everybody had to be married by an Anglican priest, no matter what religion you were, unless you were a Quaker or a Jew. All marriages, to be legal marriages, had to be conducted by the Church of England. And of course, in the Church of England, the king was the head of the church. And so it's odd. Here we go back to the marriage equality thing. Two of the main people who were objecting to marriage equality were the Archbishop, the Anglican Archbishop, and the Catholic Archbishop. And in the case of the Anglicans have already started shifting on the issues of homosexuality. They have homosexual bishops in various places. Scotland allows homosexual marriages. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the nominal head of the head priest, has said that it's up to various national branches of the Anglican Church to make their own decisions. In Australia, Archbishop Freire, who is the primate of the Australian Anglican Church, said a couple of years back that the issue should be a secular one. He really suggested that civil marriage be seen as separate and distinct from holy matrimony, that church marriage and civil marriage are not the same thing, and that people should stand wherever they want on the notion of secular marriage. He said that for the church was going to maintain one man, one woman. Yeah. In terms of Catholicism, you were
Yes,
saying that
the bastion of all morality, the Catholic Church in Australia, who's been protecting pedophile priests for and
Yeah.
dozens of them or whatever,
Yeah.
including the was it the Archbishop? What's his name? Pell.
Yeah.
You
Cardinal
know,
Pell.
I'm not saying he's a pedophile, but he he's been helping the protection of pedophiles in the Catholic
Yeah, and
Church,
the Pope didn't help in South America recently, where he was
slandering
basically
the survivors.
slandering survivors and defending people who had been charged with pedophilia.
And the odd thing about that is that he actually said that the Pope actually had said a few months ago that he was wanting that to all be outed, and sort of like and addressed. And
Yeah.
then he goes and does that,
And then he goes
slandering
and does
survivors.
that. Yeah. So the Catholic Church is a bit dicey with sexual abuse by the priests. Now, of course, they talk about, same-sex couples can't be proper parents, with the history there of priests and stuff in the Catholic Church particularly. There was an inquiry that is recently finished. It was a 5-year inquiry, I think it was, into sexual abuse in institutions. And the vast majority of the cases were put down to Catholic institutions. Thousands and thousands of witnesses came forward about abuse, sexual abuse by Catholic and in Catholic institutions.
I don't even know why these people are who are just living in the last century are even asked to get, because this is all thinly veiled homophobia.
Yeah.
The whole marriage equality thing was all about, really, are homosexuals moral person in the moral community, really?
Yeah, should they have the rights of anyone else?
Yeah, just try not to move the thing too much.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's all this is. And asking people who are just so... But, it's just so backward, and I don't know why they're even a lot of these people are just so bigoted in so many ways. I don't even know why they're given any voice.
Yeah.
To
Yeah. I don't know why either.
So anyway,
anyway, well, of course, I mean, the whole idea of the survey was precisely to give those people that voice and give them a platform where they could speak day after day and be reported in all of the newspapers and in news shows and so on.
Yeah.
And
so how is this, the religious freedom thing? Are you just giving a background to how this all came about?
Okay. So the background was that Tony Abbott and others were saying...
Tony Abbott, he was the ex-prime minister, former
the one
prime
we
minister.
were talking about, who was a massive homophobe and basically against human rights of all sorts.
Excuse me for a moment. There's a little cat wanting to get out of the room. Excuse me.
Okay, I'll take over for a second. Tony Abbott was doing that, and one of the big things he and other conservative politicians were saying was that marriage equality would be a threat to the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech. But the freedom of religion was seen as something they could hang their hats on, and what they really meant was the freedom to discriminate against people who were homosexual. They feel like it's their God-given right. It's in the Bible. Homosexuals are bad. Homosexuals should be killed. And they want the right to put that into practice in society.
Because that's what Jesus would have wanted.
That's what Jesus would have wanted. That's what God wants, because it's in the Bible. Anyway, when they couldn't get their amendments up that would put into law the right to discriminate against homosexuals, they as part of they wanted that to be part of the legislation that granted marriage equality, because they thought, either the people who favor marriage equality would knock it back because of this inclusion, or they would pass it with the inclusion in order to get marriage equality. And it was indicated that if there was a high discrimination would be made legal, that the LGBT community wouldn't want a bill that said that, even if it granted marriage equality, because it's ridiculous. I mean,
Can you believe that this is still going on? Sometimes I just think, my God, this is so.
And so the conservatives went on to basically say, okay, you managed to get marriage equality through, but we're still going to go after homosexuals and trans people. Because, and let's not leave trans people out, because one of the big reasons they said marriage equality couldn't be allowed is because of the risk of gender fluidity, that gender roles would be challenged. And there was a lot of shit about it might allow boys in dresses. I noticed that it never talked about allowing girls in trousers. That's because girls wear trousers all the time. We wear jeans, we wear pants. In fact, if you walk down the street, you'd be hard put seeing many women in skirts or dresses. Most women wear pants.
Particularly in Tasmania, because it's
Particularly
cold.
in Tasmania, where a lot of people, women are rural women, and they work on the land, and it's practical to wear pants, and it's cold.
Yeah. Even when you go into town, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of, Trish and I often laugh about the fact that when you look at women in rural Tasmania, what? When you look at women in rural Tasmania, it's often hard to tell whether they are sexual suspects or whether they're just good country girls. I think in most cases they're just good country girls wearing practical clothing.
We use that term sexual suspect just as it's a bit of a thing from the world according to GARP, where they use the term sexual suspect. It's just a bit of a joke that we have.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry.
But I mean, basically it's very practical for women to wear jeans and trousers, flannel shirt, a coat, just a warm coat.
Yeah.
And that's what people
anyway,
wear.
You get the idea.
Yeah, and the public gets the idea.
So let's.
Anyway, we'll pass that on by. But it's it's interesting, because when you talk about gender fluidity, crossing over into the gender thing, what are they talking about? This is what they're talking about. I mean, in places which rigidly enforce gender stereotypes, there would be outrage at the way most people in Tasmania dress, most women in Tasmania dress. But, I mean, the real focus, and this shows that really it's about patriarchy and maintaining that male image, is boys in dresses. That's the shock horror thing.
Yes, don't worry about the eternal perpetual wars that we're doing, killing millions of brown people overseas. Boys in dresses, that's the thing to be afraid of.
Yeah. Don't worry about boys engaging in bullying, boys rejecting study as intellectual and bad and therefore, gay or something like that.
Don't worry about rape or domestic violence.
The substance abuse or the violence you see in relation to substance abuse, mainly from young men to young men. In most Western societies, the majority of violence towards men is at the hands of other men. And generally substance abuse is involved, and almost always gender stereotypes are involved. But let's forget about that. Those are the stereotypes you want to keep, because those are the ones that are useful in war and in patriarchy.
Boys in dresses in Scotland is okay, but boys in dresses here
Yes,
is not.
because Scots in kilts are warlike.
Yeah.
That's part of the subtext of that.
Yeah, you're right. Yep.
We all love Jamie in Outlander.
Yes.
Going back to that whole thing of religious freedom, the basic thing to remember is that religious freedom was mostly about freedom from religion. It was the freedom to practice your religion in the face of a state religion which burned people as heretics. In that context, the freedom to practice your religion doesn't mean the freedom to discriminate against someone else. It means protection from discrimination by someone else. And the fact that someone is allowed to be themselves without discrimination isn't discriminatory against me if my religious belief says they're bad, any more than if I believe that it's wrong for women to be undressed, not to have, the Mormons say people should be clothed from the knees to the elbows, and they have special clothing to ensure that, and that's part of their religion. And yet we don't suggest that Mormons should be allowed to close down public beaches because people are exposing more flesh than seems appropriate. And part of our civil pluralistic society, secular society, is that people don't get to impose their prejudices on someone else. And religions are already restricted.
And say that again, part of a pluralistic society.
Part of a secular pluralistic society is that people don't get to impose their prejudices on someone else. That we recognize that there are many people with many different types of beliefs, that we live in a multicultural society, a multiracial society, in a global, multiracial, all-human world, and that there are people of all sorts, and nobody gets to say, this group is evil, and this group doesn't get to behave, in an appropriate way, as long as they're not harming anyone else. Now, of course, civil law tries to stop harm to others, and that's where anti-discrimination law comes from. Anti-discrimination law doesn't mean you're not allowed to say anything bad ever to anyone. One of the lies they told in relation to the religious freedom thing is that you wouldn't be allowed to, say, call somebody a boy or call somebody a girl, because that would be discriminatory. That's not true. And nowhere they talk about in Canada that they have done this horrible thing where language is going to be policed. This is also untrue. What was suggested in Canada was that trans people be seen as a protected class against discrimination and included in anti-discrimination laws. That doesn't mean that misgendering someone is seen as automatically discriminatory and would mean you were thrown in jail. Anti-discrimination law is actually fairly difficult to prosecute, and for fair reasons. And most of them, a lot of jurisdictions involve reconciliation, where you get the parties together and talk about situations before it's even taken into court. This happened with, I think it was Archbishop Davies, where somebody took him to court for saying in some church pamphlet that LGBTI, that same-sex parents were abusive. And they took him to court for discriminatory behavior. Now, that's not shocking or horrible. That's not anti-religious. That is due process of law. And what actually happened in due process of law was that that case went to reconciliation, where he was invited to talk to the people who said that he was being discriminatory. And the person who said he was being discriminatory decided to drop the case. I don't know how much reconciliation actually went on, but the due process occurred, and nothing whatsoever happened to Archbishop Davies, except that he had to speak to the people who felt that he was being offensive. Now, I don't see that that is a denial of religious freedom. And religious freedom doesn't mean you can do whatever you want as long as your religion sanctions that. Because an awful lot of religions say that women shouldn't have many rights. You can find religions that say men should be entitled to marry off their daughters at 14. And there are regularly scandals involving fundamentalist religions that are seen as fringe religions. They're almost always Christian religions, who engage in just that, the coerced marriage of their young daughters, usually underage daughters, to good Christian men of the same sect. And these things happen as scandals, and sometimes there are arrests made. But basically, civil law overrides religious freedom, where people are not, you're not allowed, even if the Bible says, stone somebody for this reason or another, you're not allowed to go off and stone someone. It doesn't matter what the Bible says. You are not allowed to go off and kill somebody just because the Bible says so, or the Quran, or the Torah, or whatever religious book you have. You're not allowed. Don't want mean to pick on Christianity particularly.
Try not to shake you're shaking the camera.
Not to speak about Christianity. I'm only speaking about them because they are the people who are leading this particular homophobic charge in Australia in relation to this inquiry. And they are the ones who are claiming their need for a legal right to discriminate. And the thing is, women within the Bible and within some, you have like the exclusive brotherhood or various other religious groups who see a woman's right as entirely subordinate to their husband's right or their father's right. And they call upon religious doctrine, mostly from Paul, sometimes from the Old Testament.
And he was a big misogynist,
He was a big misogynist. To reinforce this as a religious view that women have no right to make decisions for a family, they have no right to challenge a man's decision. The man should be in control of the property. The man should be in control of the family.
And her body.
And her body, that man has a right to have sex with his wife, whether she wants it or not.
And decides she's not allowed to do what she wishes with her body in relation to pregnancy?
Yeah. All of these things are seen as sanctioned by religions within certain religions. And civil law says, no one is allowed non-consensually to override the rights of other human beings. You are not allowed to kill people. You are not allowed to take someone's property. You are not allowed to override their decisions. If a woman wants medical treatment, she's allowed to get medical treatment regardless of the religion of her husband, or the doctrines within that religion that say that medicine is bad, that the will of God must be followed, that a man has the right to refuse treatment, that a woman must follow the religion of her husband. Those things are not legal. Every citizen is deemed to have rights themselves. Secular law applies. You cannot override secular law in the name of religion. Now, that doesn't mean that women can't voluntarily do this. Women could voluntarily, dress with, covering their body from their knees to their elbows, like the Mormons say. They can voluntarily put their property in their husband's name. But the husband has no legal right to enforce that if the woman doesn't want this. And so secular law overrides any kind of religious freedom in regards to virtually any kind of civil right. Now, what we're being asked is whether civil law, whether we should put the right to discriminate and override anti-discrimination law and give people the legal right to ignore this law in the name of religion or conscience. And this or conscience means that it doesn't matter, you don't even have to prove that this is a religious doctrine, that you are the member. You could never go to church at all. You could never ignore most of what religion says and say, yeah, but hey mate, I have a belief in conscience that homosexuality is bad and evil and sinful, and so I can discriminate. Now, it's important to actually look at what is being overridden. Anti-discrimination law doesn't mean you have to, it has to be very specific. You have to be denying people service. You can't put a sign on the door that says, we do not serve Catholics, Catholics not welcome, black people not welcome, Jews not welcome, Muslims not welcome. You can't put a sign on the door that says that. And you can't have that as any kind of policy. And most people are smart enough not to put a sign on the door. If you start behaving that way, then you can be taken to court as discriminatory. You can't refuse housing on those kind of bases. You can't say, I don't want you living in my house, in my rented flat or my apartment. an apartment that I own or manage because you're gay. You can't say, I don't want to pick you up from an auto accident. I'd rather leave you die because you're gay. You can't say those kind of things. That's discriminatory.
And this
You
is what
can't say that about black people. You can't say that about Muslims or Jews or Catholics or anything else. And I'm going to mention Catholics because anti-Catholic discrimination was actually something that happened here in Australia, where the Catholics were seen as part of the working class. And so there was decided anti-Catholic discrimination, and there were signs saying no Catholics allowed in Australia 100 years ago.
Yeah, and even up until 1967, Indigenous people here up until 1967 were still under the classification of flora and fauna. This is
Yes, they weren't considered they weren't granted
Isn't that awful?
human rights.
Yeah,
here.
really.
And it was under the Whitlam government that changed.
Yeah,
which was a fabulous government.
Whom we just mentioned, who the CIA helped get rid of. Anyway,
this is the law that they want to allow people to override. Yeah, they talk about, as I said, in Canada, them granting the right that they could prosecute somebody for using the wrong pronouns. This is not true. It is conceivable that somebody could claim that they're subject to discriminatory behavior if, for instance, a teacher in a university or a school consistently and deliberately misgendered someone as a form of abuse.
Yeah, like what happened in England, I think. What happened in the UK. So
there's been a case in the United
He was deliberately, repeatedly misgendering a student.
If you're provocatively doing that as an insult, then you can be accused of being discriminatory, particularly if you're in some role like the person's teacher. You can't, but if somebody casually makes a mistake, well, there's no problem at all with making a mistake. It's when it stops being a mistake.
If I just interject for a second, if you go onto Chelsea Manning's Instagram account, just have a look at the intentional misgendering that goes on there and the misogyny and transphobia. It's really appalling. And if you do happen to, come across any of that, to report, because it's just hate speech is what it is.
Yeah. And we'll just say, this happens actually a lot. I mean, if somebody calls somebody, a nigger or a faggot or, something like that.
Yeah, we just interrupted again. The card said it was full and it just stopped working. Yeah. Sorry.
Anyway, we were just talking about, if somebody is intentionally nasty and does an insult or something like that, well, there's usually some sort of form of anti-discrimination thing that can be raised. Of course, you need a witness, you need some indication, as we were saying, that it's an intentional insult. The general recommendations are not fines or whatever. The actual charges are, something basically fairly minor for those kind of things. And you see all the time of people behaving that way.
I'm sorry. I've been rubbing against your Oh, I'm sorry. I've been rubbing against the microphone.
Well, excuse me.
Sorry about that. You probably get picked up on my microphone.
Yeah.
Go on.
Anyway, that'll be, I mean, all the time you get people like, what's his name, the one who plays Kramer in Seinfeld?
Yeah,
I mean,
Michael Richards.
Michael Richards, I mean, he publicly said a lot of very nasty things, and yet he wasn't charged under any kind of legislation. People all the time are saying things and not charged.
Donald Trump says a lot of stuff, but
Yeah.
but the thing is, wait. The thing is that even though Donald Trump says a lot of, he's got sort of a terrible impulse problem with what he says on Twitter. The fact is that the government prior, Barack Obama, actually, he may not have said racist things, but he enacted a whole bunch of racist laws, and also engaged in expanded from 2 wars to 7, and killing millions of brown people, and had assassination days, like every Tuesday, a kill list where he just assassinate people. They were brown people. So basically, even though Donald Trump might be saying racist things, and he is acting, he also is doing the same sort of, he's just following on from Barack Obama. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the other presidents aren't problematic.
There's structural racism all over the place. Structural racism is common. But we're talking about anti-discrimination legislation here.
Yeah.
And in anti-discrimination legislation, you'll find there are very few actual legal actions. And most of the cases, unless they are outrageously discriminatory, the kind of fines or actions that are taken are minor. And so there's not really, it's not right for a university professor to be in front of a class and start talking about, bloody kikes or, some other form of insult, particularly when there's people of that race or religion or whatever in the class. I mean, this is an abuse of power. And those are the cases that anti-discrimination is meant to look at. It's meant to look at apartheid sort of situations where somebody is not allowed, because of their race or because of their religion or on that basis, not allowed to buy stuff in a store or to rent a flat.
And yet it doesn't really, sadly, there's plausible deniability when you sack a trans person from a job. You can sort of, if they're transitioning, and they can just pretend like it's some other reason, or make the position non-existent anymore. They can do a whole bunch of things that make... Yeah. So, that's the problem too sometimes with these laws.
It doesn't stop discrimination. It doesn't stop it. I mean, that doesn't mean, that's a good thing.
No.
People find ways around these things all the time.
Yeah.
So it has to be a really blatant form of discrimination. Now, things like the Industrial Relations Tribunal or the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, they're reasonably good at sussing out where something is systemic discrimination.
In Australia, yeah.
In Australia. Even if, the person is pretending it isn't. They can say, oh, well, there were a lot of candidates and there was a better candidate. They can say, oh, well, there were a lot of people applying for the flat and we felt there were better people. But where you can show that there is a consistent pattern of refusing highly qualified people the ability to rent a flat. And so it doesn't generally apply to somebody who owns a single flat. It generally applies because they don't rent to enough people. It applies to large-scale landlords and things like this. It applies to people in hotels who simply say, "I'm sorry, no, there was a mistake. The hotel is full," and then they rent a room to the next person who walks in, who is the right color or religion.
Yeah,
or whatever.
Indigenous people actually are often refused
Refuse service in one way or another.
in rentals and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what anti-discrimination law is intended. And including trans people as a protected class in Canada really brings you under that umbrella. It would have to be shown with proof that the person has a consistent pattern of discrimination against trans people. And it's not just a case of there was a better qualified candidate or there was somebody else who came and rented the place first or something like this.
Anyhow, so civil law is supposed to protect.
It's that, and this is what they're talking about overriding and granting people the right, if they can claim any kind of religious discrimination is part of their religion, or any kind of discrimination is something that they say is part of their conscience. And that's a bloody open door. Then they're allowed to discriminate against people. Remembering that the laws we're talking about are things like education, housing, the right to service, and so on. These are the kind of discrimination we're talking about allowing. These are the things that anti-discrimination law actually addresses. It doesn't deal with necessarily even name-calling. It might deal with somebody having a rally against somebody where it shades into hate speech. But hate speech too, I mean, you basically need to be calling for genocide, for something to be classified as hate speech. You need to be calling for violence against people in a very public way.
And the sad thing is,
any kind of insult.
Didi, and the sad thing is though that all these things, all these sorts of not allowing just equal rights is sort of promoting hatred, and it actually is in some ways it's promoting violence towards people. So even though you're not actively calling for killing of LGBTI people, these various, sort of the second class citizen,
they're sinful, saying that they're evil, saying that God hates them.
That's inciting violence.
That's inciting violence
toward them, which ends up, people either kill themselves or someone kills them. This is how it goes. There's a lot of youth LGBTIQ suicides because of the hatred and stuff.
I mean, let's go back to actual religion. It is the fundamentalist religions which, you see homeless children, particularly children who are left without a home, who have been thrown out of their home, who feel that they have to leave their home for their own emotional or physical safety. So often their home environment is one of religious fundamentalism, where they have been effectively abused for who they are. And it is the kind of authoritarian, punitive, judgmental families that cause often lifelong trauma in people in childhood environments. And these are almost always, where somebody has justified abusing their children in this way in the name of religion. Now, let's go back to that basic principle of religious freedom. Religious freedom was the freedom from religion. It's the freedom to exercise your religion in spite of the desire of some other religion to persecute you as a heretic. It is not the right to discriminate against people and abuse them. It is something that allows you the freedom to follow your own beliefs, but only as far as civil law, which protects the rights of all people, allows. It doesn't allow you to break the law. And this idea of enshrining religion, which has been notorious for persecution of people and creating these atmospheres of hatred, the sexual abuse scandals that have happened couldn't happen if there wasn't this atmosphere of the authority of the priests and knowing that if you spoke up, you would be punished for speaking up, and that nothing would happen to your abuser.
Yes, look at Dolores O'Riordan from the Cranberries. I mean, they haven't decided how she died, but I'd be guessing that it was probably, suicide, like a drug overdose. And she suffered terribly in her early life. Between the age of 8 and 12, she was sexually abused by a friend of the family, and in Ireland. And it's sort of they have some pretty backward, don't they?
But going into this thing of the connection with religion, religion is notorious for creating these situations. I mean, you've had movies that highlighted that kind of notorious things, like what was that?
Sleepers or something.
The dancing thing. Yeah.
Oh, you mean the
Footloose.
Footloose.
The movie Footloose, where they talk about religions that are so oppressive they don't allow dancing in a town.
Didn't we hear something amazing just recently where people they weren't allowed to dance in this particular town, and they would do this jig with their feet. They'd be sitting down. Where did we hear that? They were actually sort of not allowed to dance, so they used to sit in their chairs and their feet would move.
This was about Irish dancing.
Yeah.
This was Irish dancing. This is,
yes,
to some degree, how some of that was through at the folk festival.
That's right.
We heard these
Isn't
things.
that crazy?
Some of the origins of the jigs.
Yeah.
Was that they would have these things where you could kind of move your feet, and when somebody passed by the hall, and looked in the window, they would see people with their upper bodies erect and still.
So that explains.
And yet their feet were dancing.
That explains that type of dancing where their arms are by their side, and their body from there down is sort of
it's
straight.
It's an outgrowth of that because people were persecuted.
Isn't that amazing?
For dancing.
Yeah.
And this kind of abusive religious thing. I mean, and you've got.
Excuse me.
Honor killings, you've got all kinds of abusive situations in many religions where the power has been taken and imposed on people. And liberal humanism, where the freedom of religion came from, also believes in the rights of human beings for the greatest possible freedom within the limits of not harming others. And so you're not allowed to impose your views just because you're free to have those views. The freedom to have views does not imply the right to impose your views on others. Civil law, the basis of civil law, is intended to be that things like allowing assault or theft or whatever are destructive of society, destructive of communication and interaction between people. If you have to be in fear of your life when you walk out the door, or in fear of your bodily safety, then that's obviously a disincentive to social communication, to any kind of social interaction. And so it makes sense that murder, assault, rape, all these things are illegal. It also makes sense that overt discrimination is illegal, that you should be able to behave and be treated like any other person. Yeah. It doesn't grant special rights. It means you are guaranteed the right to be treated as any other person.
Something that's absent in apartheid Israel with Palestinians.
Yes. Anti-discrimination does not grant any special rights at all. It grants the right to be treated as any other person. And the idea that somebody's religious belief or belief of conscience should legally allow them to override your right to be treated as any other person is simply wrong. There can be no exemption, no valid exemption in the name of religious freedom to exemption to anti-discrimination legislation.
Oh, can I just add that what I said about Palestinians wasn't related to religion? That's Zionism.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Zionists that aren't religious.
There's a lot of forms of discrimination that are not necessarily religiously based.
Yeah.
Some of them may call themselves religiously based, but to actually put into law the right to override anti-discrimination is to put into law the right to discriminate against people. Oh.
Sorry.
You're fiddling.
I'm sorry. It's just that the microphone keeps falling down, and I end up rubbing against it, which would be fun for people when they're trying to listen to you.
Yeah.
So anyway, we should wrap it up soon.
Okay. I just want to say, in essence, this review of religion is kind of a challenge to religion itself. Yeah. Is religion, because I won't say that I'm not one of the new atheists who say all religion is inherently evil. I think for many people, religion is a source of connection, of love, of forgiveness, of understanding, of caring for others. But there is a long history and tradition of religion being used for other things to justify hatred and discrimination and abuse and systems of power.
Yeah, and the religion of the state is another one. The state religion, which is, people believe in patriotism and cause violence. People believe in lots of things, don't they?
Again, patriotism and nationalism isn't quite the same as religion.
No.
Yeah.
But people do a lot of violence in that name.
They certainly do. I mean, there's many forms of...
In fact, they even in the...
Many forms of violence and power.
You grew up in the United States and you had to pledge allegiance to the flag every morning, which you used to refuse to do.
Yeah.
Which made you very unpopular. But they'd infused God with the state, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah. That was in the 50s and early 60s, and it was... you were expected to pledge allegiance to God and the state, and
hideous. Inflicting that on children every day.
And I think at a very young age, I realized that I didn't want to do that.
It's no wonder there's an American exceptionalism myth going around that's creating all this problem. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Anyway, going back to what I was saying about religion, I mean, it is a challenge to religion. Yeah. Will religion in the future be seen as something that is benign, potentially benign, which can give people some sort of moral center to connect people? Or is religion going to be used and come under the control of people in order to promote hatred, and discrimination. And that's certainly a tendency in the United States right now, where bigots of all sorts have chosen to use the call of religious freedom to justify bigotry and justify hatred and justify violence. And this is wrong. And one of the consequences of this will be that religion will be seen as inherently evil and inherently corrupt and inherently abusive. And anybody who believes that religion is benign had best beware of this particular call for religious freedom to override the rights of other people.
Yeah. Anyway, that's. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that? And we're
No,
talking about in Australia.
This was in relation to the Ruddock inquiry. I put in a submission. Basically,
when is that going to get? When do these submissions?
That ends. I think he's supposed to come up with his findings in March.
But when do the submission date finish? You can put
I'm
in
not
submissions.
Sure,
you can put in submissions to
probably near the end of February.
Right, submissions to challenge, this inquiry.
Yes, please do. Anybody, anywhere, please look at the terms of reference and recognize that where this came from was from the conservative politicians, the conservative right wing's desire to put into law the right to discriminate. Yeah. It's not just an exemption for churches to say that, women have to sit in the back, or that only men can become priests and stuff like that. This is actually to put into law the right for people to discriminate against people anywhere, any person, on the basis of their religion or conscience.
And it's a slippery slope, when you start doing that kind of thing and eroding.
It's eroding human rights.
Yeah.
It's eroding the idea of the rights of people. It's using one particular right to try and undermine all rights.
And that's what they're trying to do in Australia.
Evil.
Yeah, that's what they're trying to do in Australia.
Yeah.
And this is just so wrong. I mean, Australia's so gone downhill in the last few decades.
Yeah.
So sad.
And it's a movement that's really started in the United States. Yeah. It's being marketed in other countries, in England, in Australia. It is intentionally promoted on a global basis.
Yeah, and if you allow one thing to go, it eventually all goes, If you allow the erosion, it all ends up going. So it's important to push back on everything. It's important, as we say, to be anti-imperialist and anti-war, and make that a global thing, because it's happening globally. This eroding human rights and oppressing people of color, etc. It's a global thing. It's a white supremacist thing too.
The erosion of human rights is everywhere.
Yeah.
Basically, it helps to allow capitalism to undermine the rights of workers and to extract the greatest value from the labor of others and concentrate it in fewer and fewer hands. It also justifies nationalism and imperialism. Racism is a big part of that. There's patriarchy is another part of that. Patriarchy is separate from that and a separate power system, but it's linked.
Yeah.
I mean, all of those national and corporate elites are patriarchal.
Yeah. Anyway, Didi, is there anything else we want to say? Because we might as well wrap it up.
Yeah, no, that's
So we might do this in part 1 and part 2s.
Yeah.
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 Okay, well, thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Viga. This is Didi River.
Yeah.
And we'll probably, next time, Didi and I will probably talk about gender stereotypes and gender diversity and, which is a very important thing and is feeding into what we've just been talking about, stereotypes which are constructed and which create abuse against various, it creates violence and it creates dysfunction.
It basically, yes, supports patriarchy. In that sense, it supports war. It supports misogyny.
Yeah.
It supports abuse of various sorts.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that next time.
Yeah.
Or soon, anyway. Okay, well, thanks so much for watching. Till next time. Bye for now.
Bye.